You ever get that feeling where a place just does not match the weight of its own history? Because that is Ballyhalbert. At first glance, it is just quiet roads, open sky, flat fields, sea air, and a few surviving bits and pieces. But during the Second World War, this was one of the key fighter airfields on the Ards Peninsula, built fast as Northern Ireland scrambled to protect Belfast, the shipping lanes, and the approaches across the Irish Sea. Construction started in 1940. The airfield was operational by June 1941. It officially opened on the 28th of June that year. It had 3 tarmac runways, 2 bellman hangars, and 12 blister hangars. Over the next few years, it hosted RAF, WWII, Royal Navy, Army, American, and Polish personnel. In Ballyhalbert, you can see the runways behind us. This is where the hangars would have been, where these 2 big mounds are. I think there would have been 2 hangars there, maybe 3, 4. Would have had the Hurricanes, the Spitfires, all that sort of thing. Actually on the base. The famous Squadron 303 and the 315 Squadron, both Polish squadrons, actually trained here before they went off and actually fought in the Battle of Britain. And then we've got the aerial tower here. So this is the actual traffic control or air traffic control tower. So we'll go over there and have a look. So as we drive along this old runway, we are not just driving on a bit of forgotten tarmac. We are moving over a surface that was laid for war. Fighters rolled here, engines screamed here, ground crews worked here in wind and rain and blackout conditions. Young pilots lifted off from this exact ground, not knowing if they were heading for patrol, training, rescue cover, or death. That is what makes a site like this so powerful. The landscape looks calm, but the story underneath it is anything but calm. And look at the runway itself. This is how the place worked. Ballyhalbert was a fighter command station. The whole field was designed to get aircraft airborne fast. Aircraft were dispersed around the site so they would not all be destroyed in one strike. Pilots were kept on readiness. Orders were passed through operations. The underground operations room, built about 3 miles away, controlled patrols over the Irish Sea and as far south as off Dublin Bay. When a patrol was needed, men ran, engines turned over, and aircraft rolled out onto these runways. This was not romantic. It was a system. Concrete, telephone lines, plotting, weather, fuel, guns, and discipline. And that matters, because when people think of an airfield, they often think only of the aircraft. But an operational wartime airfield was really a machine made of many parts. The tower saw and signalled, the operations room tracked and directed, fitters serviced engines, armourers loaded ammunition, refuelers kept aircraft ready, ground crews hauled, repaired, checked and cleaned. The runway was only the visible end of a much bigger nerve system. Ballyhalbert was built to launch fighters quickly, to defend the approaches to Belfast and to cover convoys moving through the North Channel and Irish Sea. And here is the mad thing. Once you know that, the tarmac starts to look different. It is no longer just old concrete. It becomes evidence. Maybe that is why running the car along it hits so hard. For a second you can almost imagine the change of scale. You are no longer a bloke in a modern motor. You are 20 years old, strapped into a Spitfire, headset on, canopy shut, heart thumping, throttle forward, Merlin engine howling, trying to keep straight as the tail comes up and the whole machine starts to feel alive. The Spitfire, Mark 5B, the type flown at Ballyhalbert by the Polish squadrons, was powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin producing around 1,440 horsepower with a top speed in the region of 374 miles per hour and a range of about 470 miles. In plain English, it was fast enough to intercept, agile enough to fight, and had enough reach for patrols over the sea lanes from Northern Ireland. So how did the base project power? Not through one giant gun, like a fort, but through aircraft. Ballyhalbert's range and power came from what it could launch. A fighter standing on readiness could be airborne in minutes, climb out over the sea, patrol convoy routes, intercept hostile aircraft, or escort other machines. That is why the airfield existed. It was part shield, part springboard. Its power was mobility. Its reach was measured not in a shell arc, but in flying miles, response time, and the ability to put trained men into the air exactly when they were needed. And then you find the small things, like that wartime drain cover. And that is the sort of detail I love because it drags history out of abstraction and drops it right in front of your feet. You realise this place was not built in some distant, polished way people sometimes imagine wartime sites. It was thrown up with urgency. The selection of sites happened in 1940. Construction followed fast. By mid-1941, Ballyhalbert was already functioning as a fighter field. The whole point was speed.
get the runways down, get the dispersals in, get the station working. Because Northern Ireland had already seen the reality of air threat and maritime threat. Here is the original plan, and this is where the place starts to make real sense. The control tower you went looking for was the visible brain of the airfield, but not the only one. The wider station included technical areas, hangars, living quarters, dispersals, and that separate underground operations room. So when you look at a surviving building or a broken ruin now, you are seeing one surviving organ from what was once a living body. Most of the wartime station is gone, but the layout still tells the story if you know how to read it. And the control tower matters because this is where war became immediate. This was where information arrived, where aircraft movements were watched, where the runway outside connected to the battle space beyond the coast. Today it is quiet, fenced, weathered, and half lost, but in wartime it would have been all urgency. Phones, reports, signals, timings, weather, readiness states, aircraft moving in and out. And then there is the bigger story of who flew from here. Ballyhalbert was not just an RAF field in a local sense, it became part of an international war effort. British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, Polish and other allied personnel served here. That alone is worth pausing on. Men from cities and towns across Europe and the Commonwealth ended up on this edge of County Down because the war pushed them here. Some came to defend Britain. Some came because their own country had already been invaded. Some came because the sea and air war made Northern Ireland suddenly strategically vital. That is where the Polish story becomes one of the strongest parts of Ballyhalbert's history. Between July 1943 and April 1944, RAF Ballyhalbert was home to two Polish fighter squadrons, number 315 Squadron from July to November 1943 and number 303 Squadron from November 1943 to April 1944. Their time here was largely made up of convoy patrols and training, but these were not ordinary units. They arrived with reputations forged in much harder fighting elsewhere. Number 315, the City of Dublin Squadron, had been formed in 1941, first flew Hurricanes on convoy patrols from Speke, then moved to Spitfires and flew offensive sweeps over occupied Europe before being sent to Ballyhalbert in July 1943. They arrived from RAF Hutton Cranswick and took up a fighter defence and training role here. On the 14th of August 1943, General Kazimierz Sosnkowski, Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Armed Forces, visited Ballyhalbert and decorated several of the squadron's men, including awarding the Virtuti Militari, Poland's highest decoration for military valour. That tells you how much prestige and hard service these men already carried with them by the time they reached this quiet corner of Down. Then came number 303 Squadron, the famous Kosciuszko Squadron. This was the legendary unit from the Battle of Britain. It became the most successful fighter command unit in that battle, credited with 126 German aircraft in only 42 days. So when 303 arrived at Ballyhalbert in November 1943, the local field was receiving not just another squadron, but one of the most famous fighter units of the whole war. At Ballyhalbert, they took over the Spitfire Mark 5Bs left by 315 and settled into convoy patrols, training, and air-sea rescue-related tasks. It may have looked quieter than their earlier combat, but it was still part of the war's wider machinery, especially with troop convoys increasing in the run-up to Normandy. And that is one of the strongest points in this whole story. A place can be quiet and still be important. A routine posting can still carry enormous weight. A convoy patrol over the North Channel can matter because the invasion of Europe depends on those ships moving safely. By early 1944, the men of 303 noticed that some convoy traffic was packed with American troops without yet knowing the full scale of what was being prepared. On the 24th of April 1944, the squadron got orders to move to Horn Advanced Landing Ground, ending the Polish fighter squadron's time in Northern Ireland. Now, one question people always ask is who commanded Ballyhalbert. And here I want to be straight. I could verify squadron commanders during parts of the Polish period, but I could not verify one single all-period station commander from solid public sources in a way I would trust enough to put into a final voiceover as certain fact. So I would rather tell you that honestly than dress up a guess as history. The same goes for the exact number stationed here at any one time. This was an operational airfield and numbers shifted by unit, season and role. We know it hosted multiple RAF squadrons, Polish units, WAAF, Army, Royal Navy and American personnel over its life, but I could not verify one clean figure for the whole station that I would trust enough to nail down. What we can say with confidence is that this was not a token strip. It was a fully built wartime fighter station with runways, hangars, dispersals, technical areas and command functions, active from 1941 until it passed through Royal Navy use as HMS Corncrake in 1945, then shut down in 1946. And that brings us to the tower ruin and the surviving buildings. They are powerful because they show how history decays unevenly. The runway can survive as a line, a drain cover can survive as a detail, a tower can survive as a shell, but the men, the sound, the urgency, all of that has to be rebuilt in the mind. Then the story takes a turn, and for me this is the emotional centre of the whole video, because after the runway, after the speed, after the imagined roar of engines, you arrive at St. Joseph's Churchyard, Kirkcudbright. And suddenly the war is no longer machinery. It is names, ages, dates, families, headstones. This churchyard holds graves tied directly to Ballyhalbert's wartime story, and in a strange way it explains the airfield better than the runway does. The runway tells you what the station did. The graves tell you what the station cost. Pilot Officer Jerzy Ryszard Tuczemski, born in Warsaw on the 7th of April 1919. He came to Britain, trained, joined number 315 Squadron at Ballyhalbert on the 20th of July 1943, and less than 6 weeks later, he was dead. On the 22nd of August 1943, he took off from Ballyhalbert in Spitfire Victor Bravo Alpha Bravo 245, coded Papa Kilo Lima 8, on a navigation training sortie. During low flying practice, his aircraft suffered engine trouble and crashed at Craigs Wood Long Mountain near Rasharkin in County Antrim. He was 24 years old, buried here with full military honours. Think about that. Warsaw to Britain, exile, training, a short posting in County Down, and then a grave in Kirkcudbright. That is how far this war reached into individual lives. Then Władysław Kołek. Born the 2nd of July 1917 in Mysłowice Śląskie, Poland. He trained in Britain, including pilot and air gunner training, and only arrived at Ballyhalbert on the 9th of September 1943. 2 days later, on the 11th of September, he was dead. He was flying in a formation of 3 over County Antrim in bad weather, led by Stanisław Grondowski. The formation became lost in the hills around Belfast. Kołek's Spitfire Bravo Lima 469, coded Papa Kilo Foxtrot, crashed into a farmhouse on Flush Road near Mollusk, killing him instantly. He was 26. Again, just look at the brutality of that. He barely had time to settle in. Beside him, Stanisław Grondowski, born on the 11th of April 1909 in Andruszówka, then Poland, now in modern Ukraine. He had already lived a huge aviation life before Ballyhalbert. Before the war, he was a pilot instructor at the Officer Cadet Air School in Dublin. From 1940, he flew with number 307 Squadron, survived an earlier crash, later served in Takoradi in Africa as a transport pilot, then with 112 Squadron, then 58 Operational Training Unit, and in February 1943, volunteered for number 315 Squadron. On the 14th of August 1943 at Ballyhalbert, he was decorated with the Cross of Valour by General Sosenkowski. Less than a month later, on that same disastrous day of the 11th of September 1943, he was leading the formation in bad weather when, after losing orientation, his Spitfire Victor Bravo Whiskey 3427, coded Papa Kilo Juliet, crashed near Plantation House, Lisburn. He was 34, so this was not a raw beginner. This was an experienced airman who had already crossed half the war before ending up here. And that, to me, is where the Polish story at Ballyhalbert really lands. These men were not just foreign pilots based in Northern Ireland. They were exiles. They were professionals. They were men displaced by the destruction of their own country who kept fighting under RAF command from British stations, including this one. When you stand at their graves in Kirkcudbright, you are standing at the end of journeys that began in places like Warsaw, Mysłowice, Dublin, and what is now Ukraine, and somehow finished here in a quiet churchyard in County Down. But the churchyard tells an even wider story than the Polish one. There is Pilot Officer Walter Bartholomew McManus, Royal Canadian Air Force, aged 27, buried here after dying on the 7th of January 1942. Additional sources tie him directly to number 504 Squadron at Ballyhalbert, flying Spitfire Mark II, Alpha Papa 7823, when he crashed at Derrymacash near Lurgan in County Armagh. He was from Ontario, married, and in civilian life had been a barrister and solicitor. So again, Ballyhalbert was pulling in lives from far beyond Ulster. Canada to County Down, then a grave at Kirkcudbright. There is Sergeant William Richard Willis, Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, who died on the 26th of May 1942. He was a radio observer, killed when Bristol Beaufighter X-ray 7573 crashed near Moneyknee, Lough during a training flight. All 3 crewmen died. His burial here, while one of his crewmates lies at Ballyhalbert, shows how this graveyard became part of the wider airfield story, not only the Polish chapter. There is Lieutenant Frank Wilfred McGarry, Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve, aged 25, who died on the 8th of September 1945. By then, Ballyhalbert had entered its naval phase as HMS Corncrake. McGarry was attached to No. 4 Naval Fighter School and was killed when his Corsair Juliet Tango 357 suffered engine failure. He force landed at Ballycram, about 5 miles southwest of the airfield, struck a wall, and the aircraft caught fire. He was from Toronto and had earned his wings only months before. So even after the Polish squadrons had gone, Ballyhalbert was still claiming lives. And there is something else worth saying here. Not every death tied to Ballyhalbert happened in combat. In fact, many did not. Training, weather, navigation, engine failure, bad visibility, forced landings. These killed airmen too. That is one of the strongest truths of air war. Even at a so-called quiet station, even on a training flight, even when you are nowhere near enemy fire, the danger never really leaves the aircraft. Ballyhalbert's graves are a reminder that wartime flying remained lethal even when the guns were silent. So what was Ballyhalbert used for? In one sentence, it was used to launch and support fighter operations for the defence of Northern Ireland's approaches, convoy patrols, training, readiness, and later naval fighter school activity. It opened as an RAF fighter command station in 1941, hosted multiple Allied units, including the famous Polish squadrons, shifted to naval use in 1945, and then closed in 1946. The exact aircraft and units changed, but the core purpose remained the same: put trained air power in the sky from this edge of County Down. And what is left now? A runway line, a drain cover, a control tower ruin, a few surviving buildings, a churchyard, a set of names. That might not sound like much, but it is enough. Enough to tell the story, enough to feel the story, enough to remember that this quiet bit of Northern Ireland was once connected to Warsaw, Toronto, London, Africa, the Isle of Man, the Irish Sea, and the whole violence of the Second World War. That is what makes Ballyhalbert such a strong historical site. It is not just local history, it is world history, hidden in plain sight. So when we leave here, that is really the takeaway. The runway is silent now, the tower is fenced and fading, the aircraft are gone, the roar has ended, but the story has not gone anywhere. It is still in the concrete, still in the plan of the site, still in the names 315 and 303, still in the Polish eagle on the stones, still in the Canadian graves, still in the RAF headstones, still in the fact that lads from Poland, Britain, Canada and beyond ended up in this small corner of County Down because the war demanded it, and that is why places like Ballyhalbert matter. Not because they are loud, but because they are quiet, and still manage to say all of that